The U.S. election is shaping up to be the most consequential in recent history. What will this election mean for the future of the United States, and what will be the impact on the rest of the world? You're about to find out. I'm Dan Barclay, CEO of BMO Capital Markets, and on behalf of everyone at BMO, we're proud to support the Globe and Mail U.S. Election Dialogues. These webcasts bring together some of the most seasoned professionals in policy, politics, and journalism in a series of live discussions and debates on this election. You're in for a special treat. Today's discussion is a journalistic perspective on the 2020 U.S. election, and we're thrilled to be joined by people who have shaped both journalism and history. Bob Woodward is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, best-selling author, and the associate editor of The Washington Post, where he's worked since 1971. Judy Woodruff is an award-winning U.S. broadcast journalist veteran, author, and current anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. Robert Fife is the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief, an author and award-winning journalist covering Canadian politics since 1978. We're glad you could join us. Enjoy the event.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 3 of the Globe and Mail's U.S. Election Dialogues. I'm Adrian Morrow, U.S. correspondent for the Globe and Mail, and I'm thrilled to be here today as your interviewer and host. This is the final segment of our U.S. election series as we approach the final days of the 2020 presidential campaign. Our discussion will focus on both the challenges of reporting on this election, as well as the role of today's journalists in the democratic process. We've also received many audience questions for our guests today. We'll get a few of those answered closer to the end. So let's meet our panelists. First, joining us from the Canadian capital is Robert Fife, the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau chief. Robert has covered Canadian politics for over 4 decades. He's a leader in the field, breaking major political news stories, including the Senate expense scandal in 2013, and more recently, the SNC-Lavalin scandal. In a recent profile of his career, the Hill Times noted Bob's, quote, knack for knowing when people aren't telling the truth, which has helped him get many a scoop. Please welcome Robert Fife. Next, we're very pleased to be welcoming the managing editor and anchor of PBS NewsHour, Judy Woodruff. Judy has had a storied career covering every White House since Jimmy Carter and interviewing nearly every living president since then. We're looking forward to hearing some of her stories on that subject. Judy is also a recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award for Broadcast Journalism, among many other prestigious accolades. Please welcome Judy Woodruff. And last but not least, we are excited to welcome Bob Woodward, associate editor of the Washington Post, author of the headline-grabbing new book, Rage. Bob is, of course, one half of the Woodward and Bernstein reporting team that broke the Watergate scandal in 1973. Their book on the subject, All the President's Men, was regarded by Time magazine as perhaps the most influential piece of journalism in history. Please welcome Bob Woodward. My first question, does the chaos around Donald Trump make his White House harder to cover, or is it actually easier in some ways? Judy, you've covered 7 presidential administrations, so maybe you can start us off on this one. How does this compare?
Adrian, hello. First of all, it's so great to be with you and to be with these other terrific journalists, Bob Woodward, whom I know, and Robert Fife, whose reputation I know, and good to be with all of you. Is it easier or harder? I would say it's both. It's easier because, in a sense, because there's more news. I mean, this is a news machine of a president. He creates news when he breathes. And it's not just tweets. It's when he talks to the press, when he gives an interview, when he talks to a friend on the phone or says something to the staff. It's all generating news, not to mention when he signs a piece of legislation into law. On the other hand, it's harder because we've never seen a president like this. We have to do a lot more fact checking, which I know you're going to get into in a minute. There are just a mountain of challenges in covering this president. So the answer is it's both.
Bob, you spoke with Trump 17 times for your new book. What's it like to interview him compared with previous presidents?
Well, Trump, as Judy says, is different in every way. And he agreed to be interviewed for this new book because he wasn't interviewed for the first book I did on him, Fear. And he, of course, denounced the book as fake news. But a number of people said, gee, it's true. And so he agreed to be interviewed for this. I mean, for Trump, it's a dance, it's an interaction. It was a very strange experience for 8 months because I could call him. I had a number and he would come on the phone, or he would call me back quite quickly, or he called about 7 or 8 times here, 10 o'clock at night or on the weekends. But I was able to prepare questions about what was going on right at that moment. And he, for some reason, which I cannot fully explain, allowed me to push him. And as you know, he loves to just change the subject and move away from something that might be uncomfortable. But many, many times he let me go into some of the uncomfortable areas, like race relations, like the pandemic, like the real state of the American economy.
Did we learn anything, or did you learn anything from talking to him that you didn't know before, that hadn't been clear to you and sort of watching his public appearances?
Oh, did I learn new things from Trump? Yes, indeed. We've released audios on this. It was very clear in early February that he knew. I didn't know exactly how. It took me until May to figure out, but he knew that the pandemic was coming, that it was airborne, that people who didn't have symptoms could spread it. And of course, that's the key problem with this pandemic. He also made it very clear that he was trying to downplay it. He was worried that he might create a panic. I think that reflects his failure to understand the people in the United States he leads. If people are told the truth, I think by and large, they don't panic. In fact, they are happy to be led out of a crisis. But what Trump has done, he's just dodged the crisis.
Speaking of the truth, the Washington Post has tallied about 25,000 false statements from Donald Trump since he took office. How do you guys report on them without spreading them? You know, at what point do you sort of push back or fact check? And has there ever really been another president like this?
Wow. I mean, those numbers, 25,000 or whatever, there are important things that are untruth, and there are unimportant things. And I think you have to figure out what the really important matters are. When I first interviewed him, I asked the simple question, what's the job of the president? And this is back in December of last year. And he said, to protect the people. That's, I think, a good answer. Now you look at 10, 11 months later and measure him by his own definition of the job. He has failed. He has not protected the people. He is, I mean, here we have just last weekend, the chief of staff, Mark Meadows, saying, oh, well, we can't control a pandemic anymore. That's as if they've just given up. No one would sensibly say that's the way to protect the people.
Judy, what about you? How do you sort of fact check the president, you know, when you have to sort of air something that he's saying for journalistic reasons, but you know that there's something in it that's not, you know, not sort of borne out by the facts? How do you handle that?
Well, I think the first thing we have to say, and this picks up on what Bob just said, is that we've never seen a president like this who felt so loose with the truth, who felt frankly unrestrained by the need to stick to what is known science or known facts, things that can be borne out. So I think it took us all a little while to understand that we were dealing with a very different leader, a very different president when he took office. But eventually, I think we in the press understood that it's very much our job to correct, as Bob said, correct the things that matter. But a lot of it just slides by because we don't have enough time in a day often to pick up on every single thing that he said that is either a misrepresentation or an exaggeration or just something that doesn't stick to the facts. And I think it's really important to say, Adrian, that we know politicians always they fudge a little bit. They exaggerate. Mm-hmm. They want to make themselves look better. They want to make their record look better. But we've never seen it. I'm going to turn this off. We've never seen it at this level that it's at right now. And we've had to learn how to cover it. My rule at the NewsHour is that when we're covering something, when the president says something that is clearly false and that's worth pointing out, we say so. I don't like using the term, and we don't use the term lie. I think that's something you can only know by knowing what's in someone's mind, that they're deliberately stating a falsehood. But I think it's enough for us to point out the president said this, but in fact, Y or Z. But we have to do that often.
Speaking of this sort of working from a common set of facts, the U.S. is currently sort of polarized on just about everything from, race to the pandemic, to healthcare, climate. Is there sort of a tension between covering all the different sides of a story in the name of objectivity versus trying to find the truth, get at the truth in such a divided country? For instance, how do you handle reporting on something like climate change, where it's clear there are, some scientific truths, but not everybody accepts them?
If you're asking me, you cover, our view is, and my view is, you cover every bit of it. You cover the story as it changes. You talk to the experts, you talk to the scientists, and you talk to the skeptics. But you also keep the skeptics in perspective. I know there was a time, maybe a decade or so ago, and it's still the case, where we would report a story around climate change, and there would be just a wave of critical letters and emails back in the day, but even before Twitter, people saying, "Oh, well, you don't know that," and we were always careful. We've always been careful to reflect. But today, the science around climate change is so overwhelming that we don't feel that every time we do a story around climate change that we have to spend equal time, for example, with the skeptics. It's just we're way past that point today. So it's judgment comes into this, common sense, and science. And but my view is, our view is, you cover the whole story. You cover the advocates. You cover the critics. And you let the audience judge for themselves. But at some point, you don't owe everybody equal time.
And Robert, so on the objectivity front, what's it like covering the Trump administration as a Canadian reporter? Is it sort of possible, to be objective about somebody like Trump when his agenda for Canada-U.S. relations is all about, putting tariffs on our metals exports, threatening to end free trade, doing these sorts of things that, most of our audience presumably would not agree with?
Well, look, in Canada, as around the world, everybody or most people regard President Trump as someone who is unpredictable, erratic, and often ignorant of the facts on complex issues. But as a Canadian journalist, our principal concern when Trump came in was his promise to, or threat to, abrogate the NAFTA, which has been an enormous benefit to this country and to Mexico and to the United States. And our concern, the Canadian politicians' concern, but journalists' concern too, was what would the effect be if NAFTA was abrogated? It would have a really serious effect on the Canadian economy, because over 82% of our goods flow south. The government, though, did put together a pretty smart strategy in dealing with Donald Trump, which is, first of all, try not to antagonize the president, because you don't know what he's going to do when he starts tweeting. And they put a strategy together of working with key players in the administration. Doors were opened by Brian Mulroney, the former prime minister. They had the key players in the business community, from Tom Donahue of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Stephen Schwartz from BlackRock, and they worked a very smart strategy working with the U.S. Congress, lobbying Congress, and U.S. state governors, 38 states. Canada is their number one trading partner. So the focus was really on, as a journalist, our focus was on the substance of those talks. And occasionally, Trump would let loose when he got angry a couple of times at Trudeau, at the G7 summit here. He was angry with him and he let loose on him, and he got angry again at Trudeau when he made a joke at a London meeting with other world leaders, and he was spotted laughing at Trump. But for the most part, the Canadian government and Canadians focused on a free trade deal, which was signed and has been, I think, enormous benefit to both the United States and Mexico, because we upgraded this. In terms of steel and aluminum, these are, even though Canadians don't like the fact that he's used national security as an excuse to impose tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel, since we are the United States' best ally. But nonetheless, these are kind of bilateral trade disputes that we often see in our country with the United States. So trade is an issue that we sort of see all back and forth. So I don't think we should make as much about that. So the Canadian strategy has always been try not to antagonize Donald Trump and try to work around him.
What did this look like? What was it like covering the the Trudeau-Trump relationship compared to previous kind of bilateral relationships you've covered? I mean, I think of George W. Bush and Jean Chrétien as not having the greatest relationship. I mean, is there any kind of comparison there? I mean, what did this actually look like? Practically trying to cover as a reporter.
Well, I mean, when we were talking to people in the Prime Minister's office, they had the same view, which is that, look, Trump is a really difficult guy to deal with. He's very thin-skinned. He surrounded himself with people in the White House which kept changing that we were not used to. And my view was that the Prime Minister's office and the view of everybody was, we are not going to do anything to get this guy really riled up against Canada. Now, we've had this in the past where Richard Nixon did not like Pierre Trudeau. He called him some not very nice words on tape. Brian Mulroney had a wonderful relationship with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. I mean, those relationships brought us about NAFTA, brought about acid rain treaties, brought about a lot of very positive things for both countries. We had less of that with George W. Bush and John Chrétien because Canada wouldn't support the Iraq War, and it turned out was a smart move on our behalf. But we've never seen anything like this. A thin-skinned president who doesn't know very much and will let loose on TV, on Twitter, if he doesn't like anything a Canadian Prime Minister says about him.
The question I had is sort of for anybody who wants to take this, but how do we cover Trump without allowing the sort of clickbait insults to drown out serious reporting on policy? How do you handle it, for instance, when he floats conspiracy theories about the deep state or these sorts of things? Because on one hand, it's sort of important to explain that this is part of his political message. This is how he sort of motivates his base. But at the same time, you don't want to necessarily spread their reach. I mean, how do you kind of balance those, those kind of imperatives with him?
No, I mean, real quickly, that we've got to, in the news business, do some serious introspection. Goes back to 2016. How did we miss the coming of Trump? I spent some time talking to Trump about this. I think that the old order of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were disintegrating, collapsing. I think many people in the news business did not see this, did not realize it. I think Trump did. I think the other element is you've got to start there and realize we didn't understand, quite frankly, what was going on in our country. And that's a big problem for journalism. So we have to retool a little bit and figure out a new way to cover him. And Adrian, you asked the question about how do you deal with the tweets or the things that are insignificant. I think you've got to keep your eye on the ball right now. The ball is the pandemic. The second ball is the pandemic. I think the third ball is the economy in the United States. Clearly, the issue of race relations is there. And if you try to connect what Trump's saying and what he's doing to those issues, I think you're on a much better track than reacting to some of the cruel and outrageous things he says about people, including people who've been close to him, people he gave cabinet offices to.
Do you feel we ever focus too much on Donald Trump to the exclusion of covering other stories that are going on in the U.S.?
Let somebody else go here.
Yeah, I do think we do. I think it's a battle we fight every day. When we have our meeting every morning to discuss what we're going to do on the news hour that evening, and we go over the long list of potential stories, a third or a half or even more of them may be related to something the president said or did or is about to do. And we have to resist the temptation, and we do resist the temptation to just be sucked into this constant Donald Trump watch. He is, as I mentioned earlier, he's a news machine. He breathes, he makes news, he thrives on it. He knows how to keep himself at the center of the news agenda. He's brilliant at doing that. And we have to be focused, as Bob said, on what's important. And right now, it is the pandemic, it is the economy, it's the fact that a lot of people are suffering who don't get attention every day. It's education. Families across the United States today are suffering, trying to figure out how to get their children educated at home or virtually or part of the time in school. But the list goes on. It's the environment. There's so many stories we need to be covering. And we have to resist the temptation to just cover that shiny object every day. And we do, and we have to keep on doing it.
Joe Biden is running a classic frontrunner sort of bubble campaign. Reminds you a little bit of Stephen Harper in 2011. Some of that is obviously pandemic related and the kind of safety precautions he's taken, but it also looks like a calculated choice to keep the focus on Trump and avoid Biden making any gaffes or mistakes, which he's sort of famous for doing. Have reporters had enough opportunity to stress test Biden and his ideas? Do you feel like we know exactly what the U.S. would get if Biden were to win? I might kick that to Robert Fife. I mean, having covered Prime Minister Harper for years, and also sort of watching the kind of coverage of Biden, coming out of the U.S. Do you feel like there's been enough of an opportunity to sort of stress test the guy, given that he really hasn't been out front the way that the president has?
Well, I read the New York Times and the Washington Post every day. I do think that the American media have covered Biden fairly and have put his policies under the microscope. In terms of how we in Canada are looking at Biden, should he win the presidency, I don't think we're under any illusions that life is going to be somehow better. There are going to be these ongoing trade disputes because Biden is going to take a more protectionist stand, not as much as President Trump, but he will be protectionist because that's where the United States is right now. But our main concern with President, if Biden wins, is we want a partner to deal with the climate change crisis. We've had this before with American presidents, with Obama and with Ronald Reagan, believe it or not, but we do not have it with President Trump. And this is one of the most important issues facing the world. And I think if Biden comes in, you're going to see a lot of movement on climate change, but we will still have difficulties with trade.
Bob, there's a New York Times profile of you last month that mentioned that you have an archive on Joe Biden. Have you uncovered anything big that we don't know about yet?
No, I shared it with my colleagues at the Washington Post, but I wrote 2 books about Obama. The first, Obama's Wars, about Afghanistan, and the second about the budget negotiations. And very significantly, Obama turned over lots of the responsibility for some of these serious foreign policy issues, definitely on the budget negotiations, to Joe Biden. Something I find very baffling. Obama's going around now, and it's clever and it's funny, and he's attacking Trump, making fun of Trump. But I think what people want to know is, what did Biden do for Obama for those 8 years? And my reporting showed, and I spent lots of time with Biden and a good deal of time with Obama and the people who were involved in this. And Joe Biden was a pillar of the Obama administration, and meeting after meeting, he was the one who was leading it. I find it strange, quite frankly, maybe Judy Woodruff can answer this, that Obama will not come out and say this about Biden and talk about him, not just in a general way, but say, look, he did this for me, he did that. He handled all the serious budget negotiations with the Republicans. That's a big deal. They solved some of the problems, not all of the problems, but Obama is, he's kind of got a nightclub act going out, and it's quite funny what he has to say about Trump. I wonder whether it really is getting to the heart of the issue to provide information to voters about who Biden is and what he might be like as president.
Judy, did you have a take on that?
Well, I think what the Biden campaign is doing is they realize, they think they're in a good place. They're not taking it completely for granted, of course, but what they see, what they need right now is to make the final case against Donald Trump. They don't want Joe Biden to be the issue in this campaign. They don't want to leave any opening. They don't want Obama or anybody else to say something about something that happened during his vice presidency or the time he was in the Senate that could open a door to a different story. They are very happy to keep the focus on President Trump. But I do think Bob is right about Biden's record. We've covered it. We know this man. I've known him for decades, as Bob has. And the reason Barack Obama leaned on him so much is that he had 30, 35 years in Washington by the time Barack Obama chose him as his running mate, and he leaned on him to be his eyes and ears on Capitol Hill. He had all these relationships going back for a long time. He also leaned on him to a degree in foreign policy. So there is a record there to be plumbed, to be explored, but people don't seem to be in a mood to press for it right now. We are just days away from this election, and people seem to be happy to just pour it on against the president.
Curious, all three of you have been at this for decades. I mean, how has social media changed the way that you do your job as journalists and that you cover politics?
I don't use social media much, quite honestly, but I think it has created a culture of impatience and speed. So it reduces, give it to me in a word or a sentence what's going on, and I think that's very, very unfortunate for politics. But I think the spine of what's going on, I think polling is broken. People, particularly on cable news, cover the latest poll here, the latest poll there. I don't know what it really is measuring. I think it's measuring that they found 2,000 people in the United States by calling 50,000 people, and those 2,000 people who are kind of detached enough to actually answer the phone and answer questions. And I don't think that's a representative sample. And leaning on polling, I may turn out to be a giant mistake once again, as it happened in 2016.
But actually, to pick up on that, because the polling debate has been going on it's probably about the last 10 years or so that, in Canada, there are a couple of sort of big polling misses on provincial elections and all this sort of soul searching about how people got it so wrong. And then, in the US, obviously in 2016, that came up. What is sort of the alternative there? Or how do you kind of get a stronger sense, given that there are these kind of misses in this method that, that's always sort of sold to us as scientific, how do we really know what's going on when we feel that we can't necessarily trust sort of the horse race figures anymore?
Can I answer that, Adrian?
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good idea for serious news organizations to run their coverage of election campaigns by depending on polls. At the Globe and Mail, we have tried to avoid that. And the way to cover an election campaigns is it's been going on for a long time. The great David Broder of the Washington Post used to go out in the country and interview and talk to people, and he was almost bang on every time he called an election campaign. We as journalists, despite the difficulties that we have in terms of COVID, but in terms of the financial pressures facing the news media organization in the United States and Canada, we as journalists and responsible news organizations have to get our reporters out in the country talking to people. That is crucial.
And I guess I'm sort of curious about, because you get, do you risk sort of, falling, purely into the kind of realm of anecdote when you do that? Because I think of sort of covering the Bernie Sanders campaign earlier this year and going to just about every primary state. He seemed to have larger crowds and sort of more energy than Joe Biden. But then, in South Carolina and then on Super Tuesday, Biden just sort of swamped him. I mean, is it sort of possible with that kind of anecdotal reporting to necessarily sort of always understand kind of what the big picture looks like?
My approach is, let's describe who these people are, what they say, what they're doing, what their actual policies are. I think the more serious we make, I know Judy Woodruff agrees with this, the more serious we make American journalism, the better off we are. We're serving the people who watch or read or listen. We are also serving the candidates. The more serious we are, the more serious our questions are, the better the candidates are going to be. And it's an immense responsibility, but I think there's an X factor in all of this, to be frank. And that is, there is evidence and there is polling that's not public that shows very conspicuously that the Trump voter is much more committed to Trump and will crawl through the snow for 20 miles to vote. And in the case of the Biden voter, it is not that level of commitment. And it's not just kind of surface enthusiasm, going to rallies and so forth. It's, and Judy knows this so well, and Robert does also, that the Democratic Party in America never really has had the discipline to get out and organize on their behalf. They've won some campaigns and they may well win this. I think most likely Biden will win, but there is a lack of discipline to get the voters out, and evidence I've seen and heard about, the Republicans are actually doing that. So, we may be in for a November surprise.
Well, if I could just pick up on what Bob said, he's absolutely right about we need to be serious about this. I will say, I'm reminded of that old saying, Democrats like to fall in love with their presidential candidates, Republicans fall in line. Well, now we've reversed that. Republicans are the ones who've fallen in love with Donald Trump. And for this election and the 2016 election, Democrats are being asked to fall in line. And they're being driven not even by loyalty, but by, frankly, antipathy toward Donald Trump. Bob, I do agree with you that the Trump voters out there who I've followed over the last 3-4 years adore the man. They would crawl over broken glass to vote for him. But there is an equal, and we'll just see whether it's bigger or not, there is an equal fierce opposition to him that makes up, I think, the base of the Biden vote. It's not people who are so enthralled with Joe Biden. It's people who just can't stand the idea and worry about the fate of the country if Donald Trump is elected again. And I am talking to folks in different organizations who are saying, the Democrats are organized this time. They are pouring unbelievable amounts of money. Like Bloomberg is putting millions into getting out the vote in Florida and Texas. and other places. Other people I mean, Democrats have money coming out of their ears in this election. And they're putting a lot of money into turning out that vote because they know in the past the Trump voter is exactly what you said. They're determined to vote for him, and Democrats are going into this election, I think, with their eyes wide open. But we'll see what happens.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Judy, because you raised a couple of areas in which, Trump, you sort of say, is a pretty unprecedented president, or does things, completely differently from anybody who's come before him. Having covered every administration since Jimmy Carter, is there anything about any of them that really compares to Trump, or is he sort of in every way this kind of singular figure in history?
The answer to the first question is no. I covered the White House under Carter and Ronald Reagan. And of course, I have covered Washington, so have covered the White House, if you will, tangentially under President H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and so on. And now this White House. But I've never, ever, I mean, we've never had a president in this country who had no role in public affairs, neither serving in an elected or appointed office or serving in the military. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, he hadn't worked in politics, but he had done public service, certainly. We've never elected someone who came at it purely from a private background. And in his case, somebody who was a reality TV star. So it's just a different kettle of fish, a different set of qualities. And that's why I think it's taken all of us a while to understand what we're dealing with here. He's sui generis. I don't go back. I mean, people have said, well, there was Andrew Jackson. I don't go back quite that far. But I mean, in reading history, I don't remember anyone quite like this. So we're learning a lot. We're still learning about him. It's not to say he won't get reelected for all the reasons we've been discussing, but we've had to learn, we've had to accommodate in order to figure out the best way to cover him and to serve the American people at the same time.
Bob, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned earlier. You discovered in the course of reporting your book that Trump knew, in late January, sort of had a pretty good idea of how bad the pandemic was going to be, and then chose deliberately to downplay it. Confirmed later on with other sources, sort of exactly what information he was getting at the time. Why did you save that for your book rather than doing a story on it last spring?
Well, no one who's read the book would not really understand what happened when Trump told me in February and laid out that this pandemic was coming. I thought he was talking about China. In February if people go back and look, the idea of the pandemic or the virus coming to the United States was not on anyone's radar. Dr. Fauci, the expert in the United States on this, on February 29th, told people, go to the gym, go to the movies, go to the malls. It's possible something's coming, but he was he kind of green-lighted America at that point. It was not until May that I learned about the top secret meeting the end of January, when this was put on out in great detail for President Trump. And if you read the accounts, which are verified and confirmed now, you realize he had a responsibility to go out and share this information with the public, and he did not. And we now are in a situation that's not just a crisis, but I think it's very definitely a tragedy. The other thread in this, I think, is you learn, I know from doing 9 presidents, I've even done more than Judy, that the concentration of power in the American presidency is absolutely staggering. Presidents Trump controls the media, but he controls foreign affairs. He, in a way, has power that I think is greater than any president has had, at least going back to Nixon, because Trump seizes it, he talks about it, he uses it. People say, and this is true, the news can be going along and Trump will tweet, and everyone, and cable news, newspapers, as Judy was saying about the news hour, you kind of drop everything because Trump has spoken. Now, sometimes it's not true, sometimes it's a diversion, but he is the magnet for that kind of interest and coverage. If you look at what's going on television, you naturally want to tune in to Trump because the unexpected quite likely will happen.
I think that's an interesting point about Trump having, as you say, sort of seized the presidential power, a president's prerogative more forcefully than previous presidents. Do you feel that he's really gotten a lot done or achieved a lot as a president?
No, he has not achieved a lot as president. Now, Robert was talking about the replacement for NAFTA, which the USMCA, and that actually is a very good agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Has lots of very progressive elements in it that really protect workers, protect it is such an advance over NAFTA, but in the political back and forth as Trump denounced NAFTA and never would kind of get into a lot of specifics, we kind of lost the achievement there. But I think the USMCA is a giant achievement, which Trump, interestingly enough, just does not take credit for like he should.
I mean, he will go down in whatever history, because of the tax cuts, to a degree because of the peace agreements, peace deals between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors. But beyond that, so much of the Trump legacy, in my view, is what he's undone. He's undone as much as he possibly could of President Obama's environmental actions, immigration. We see what he's tried to undo, new restrictions he's tried to impose. When you look at what he's done with regard to education, moving it more toward choice as much as he can. But it's a conservative imprimatur, and probably the Supreme Court will be the most lasting legacy, because now he's had the really astonishing opportunity to choose 3 justices of our 9-member Supreme Court, frankly, giving it an imprint that will be with us for decades to come. And the same thing with the circuit, our appellate court system, and our federal district courts. That's a mark that will be there for a long time.
To move to a few questions that we've got from our audience. One is, how can responsible journalism combat the notion, I think this is for anyone who wants to take it, how can responsible journalism combat the notion of fake news that Trump uses to deride stories he doesn't like?
Lots of silence, real quick. I mean, this again is one of Trump's effective attacks. And there is lots of distrust in the media. In doing the book on him that came out last month, Rage, I found by releasing the audio so people could hear in his own voice what Trump was saying, okay, now maybe not actually believe it, because he's confirmed that this is his voice. He has the most recognizable voice in the world. And that, we have to figure out ways to make sure our work is believable and credible. And it's not just in the right wing or conservative media that there is doubt. There is doubt everywhere about the media, and we've got some work to do to figure out how to present a product that not only is more credible but more useful to people.
A lot of trust has been lost in the news media. It was already headed in that direction, but now under President Trump, there's enormous, just a gaping hole in whatever trust there was in the media. The president, by calling us enemies of the American people, by describing every story he doesn't like as fake, and entire news organizations as fake, and denigrating individual reporters and their employers. This is a president who's done enormous damage to the free press in this country. And it's going to take a lot of work for us to even begin to try to rebuild the trust that we should have.
Bob cited one, good example of sort of how you rebuild that trust by, maybe opening our own process a bit more to scrutiny, showing the audio of these interviews, that kind of thing. Are there any other ideas that we need to be looking at as journalists for, restoring trust in the media when so many Americans, think that we're just making things up?
Again, transparency. The more transparent we are, if we can say, when we've done an interview, if we can't show the whole interview on television, then say go online and you can see the entire interview for more context. The more we just keep our heads down, frankly, and just keep reporting, keep ferreting out information, facts, and keep putting it out there for people to look at. There are days, I'll be honest with you, and I think I'm fighting a losing battle because there's just so much junk floating around right now. I interviewed voters this week around the country, and some of the things that they cite and quote as what they know to be fact is astonishing to me, because I know those things are not true, and yet they've heard it from some source, some news organization they listen to, or maybe they read it on Facebook, I don't know. But there's just a lot of misinformation and false stuff flying around. And, we have to keep working to build up some kind of base of fact and eventually the truth. I don't pretend that we can get to ground truth every day, but we can at least work on the facts. And we have to keep doing it. It's a must.
Another audience question. When is it acceptable for reporters to go from reporting to analysis and opinion? I might kick this one to Bob Fife.
Well, look, I think as reporters, let's stick with the facts. Let's provide both sides of the argument, and let them, the people you interview, do the analysis, or experts outside do the analysis. It's a bit different when you're on television and you're being interviewed. You do more analysis than you would do in your news coverage. I'm a little worried because I do see a number of reporters who are trying to mix with straight reporting their analysis or their viewpoint in the stories. And I think that's a mistake. An editor should be much more careful in how they deal with that. And I just want to add to what Judy and Bob were saying is that, one of the problems we have too, and it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Canada, and we're losing all of these newspapers in cities and towns across North America. And that's a real disservice to Canadians and Americans who relied on their local newspaper for information that would substantiate what is actually going on. And we as journalists have to, our news organizations have to continue to do the job of serious reporting. I remember when the Trudeau government came in, they were all enamored with Vice and Huffington Post, and they were saying, oh, the Globe and Mail is old media. We don't have to worry about you guys anymore. Well, trust me, they do worry about us now because we do serious journalism and we put their policies and their mistakes under their microphone and microscope, and it does make a difference. So we have to do what we're doing every day is serious journalism.
Right. Can I just direct myself to that question? As I finished this book on Trump and spent 9 hours interviewing him, people in the administration, the CIA, the Pentagon, the State Department. And as I was writing the epilogue, I typed out, in summary, in totality, Trump is the wrong man for the job. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, that's, as Robert suggests, that's an opinion. And then I tried to go as deep inside as I could. And I quite honestly felt it was a conclusion based on overwhelming evidence. And that I felt that that was my conclusion. I couldn't run away from it. And I think Judy knows some of this, but there are lots of Republicans in Washington, particularly Republicans in the Senate, who in deep privacy would say, yes, Trump's the wrong man for the job, but they will not say it publicly. And as I was confronted with that, I decided I was not going to join the ranks of the silent and not say what my conclusion was based on evidence. And I think in Washington, there's too much silence. I think silence in politics or in anything is a poison. And so I had to weigh all of that and talk to my editors and talk to my wife, Elsa, and said, no, it's okay for you to state that conclusion. Some people take it as an opinion. The first book I did on Trump fear that came out in 2018, I said that the executive branch is going through a nervous breakdown. That's pretty much saying that Trump's the wrong man for the job, but not quite as explicitly. So anyway, that's how I dealt with that choice. And I think the world, we are in a different world now. And I don't think you should just offer opinions helter-skelter. But I think when you do, as I had the opportunity to spend 5 years studying Trump, writing 2 books on him, to not share my conclusion when I felt it was so overwhelming would have been unacceptable on a human level, and I think on a journalistic level.
And it's actually a wonderful example for other journalists to hear Bob Woodward talk about the lengths to which he went to think about making that conclusion public, to say that he thought about it long and hard, that it was based on so much reporting that he had done, that he didn't just willy-nilly say, I think that or I think this. It was based on real reporting, real information. I think it's a lesson that every journalist should heed.
Another audience question. We got at this a little bit before, but I'm curious for your thoughts on this kind of sort of more directly. Most reporters, pundits, and pollsters were wrong about Trump's chances of winning in 2016. What, if anything, is the media doing differently for 2020?
Well, Bob, I'll just say very quickly, as Bob mentioned earlier, most of us got it wrong in 2016. We did look at polls and other information, and frankly, we just didn't, even the Trump campaign itself didn't think that they had a chance of winning. They were as shocked as everybody else, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 people who were flying high inside that campaign and thought they had the magic sauce. But most of the people working for him didn't think he was going to win. And certainly the Clinton campaign was taken by surprise. What we're doing this time is we are taking nothing for granted. We are talking to voters. We are talking to voters all over the country. We are not ignoring or paying less attention than we should to some of these what we call, I hate the term flyover country because I was born in Oklahoma. I have family in the middle of this country, and I love it there. But my point is that we can't afford to ignore any chunk of voters. We need to talk to all sides and stay humble until the very end. Look at the polls. I mean, because the pollsters are trying hard to get it right. They don't want to make a mistake. And most of them, I think, do a good job. Clearly, some do not. They cut corners. Some of them are slanted. Others are play it straight. But it's do your reporting, talk to voters, talk to people who are in the field, compare the campaigns, compare their ground games. and just, but again, stay humble until the very last minute.
One final audience question I think we've got a couple minutes time for. How do we as journalists help bridge the country's divides, or is that even our role?
If I can tell an old story, Judy remembers Katharine Graham, who she knew quite well. Katharine was the owner and the publisher of the Washington Post. And after Nixon resigned in 1974, so that's what, 46 years ago, imagine that. And she sat down and decided to write Carl Bernstein and myself a letter, and she did it on yellow legal stationery because I'm not sure it was a yellow legal pad. It wasn't really stationery. And dear Carl and Bob, now Nixon's resigned. You did some of the stories. Now do not start thinking too highly of yourself. As Judy said, humble. But then Katharine Graham went further. She said, let me give you some advice. And my advice to you is beware the demon pomposity. And the demon pomposity is so evident in so much of, I'll broaden it, North American life, not just in the media, but in politics, in business, in entertainment, and the pomposity of, gee, there's only one way to look at this. There is only one way to do it. Yes, you have to make your judgments, but it can be done in the context of, yeah, there's another way to look at this. When my book came out, Trump denounced it, and then he said he read it one night and found it boring. I think that's a fair critique. I doubt he actually read it. But then a Fox News anchor asked him, said, is it accurate? And Trump said, well, it's fine, it's okay. And then I guess he'd read enough of it because 20% of the book are quotes from him, because I spent so much time talking to him. I wanted him to have his say. And he said, I said lots of great things in that book. So, he's not going to, I think, recommend it to anyone, but he was talking about himself and pointing out that he said lots of great things. So I think, this notion of we're only journalists. Ben Bradley, the editor of the Washington Post, used to run around and say, it's only journalism. And that didn't mean to diminish it. That meant to say we have a narrow road to walk. We have to find out what goes on. We have to make our judgments. And let's not think that we're policymakers or politicians.
Great. In 45 seconds or less, Judy, any thoughts on bridging the country's divides or the demon pomposity?
Well, I so love what Bob just said. I'm still absorbing it about the pomposity. So true. I go back and forth on this. I mean, there are days I wake up and I think there must be a better way. There must be a way to bring this country together. But at the end of the day, it's not the role of the press to do that. The role of the press is to cover what's there. And frankly, I mean, I hope as a citizen, I hope that people can find a way to come together because the animosity right now, the anger is at a level I've never seen it. And it can't be good for our democracy. So as a human being, as a citizen, I hope it goes away. I'm not sure it's the role of the press to try to bring people together. Our job is to cover what's going on and to inform.
Excellent. It's a great note to end it on. Thank you all so much for joining us for this. Thanks everybody for attending. Have a great day.
Thank you.